Hello, welcome back everyone. My name is Christina. I'm the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 47? 47, yeah, sure. Day 47 of our read along together of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Today, we're going to start out with some tea. I found a tea that had been in the cupboard that had gotten buried in the back, and that's why I haven't had it for a while. But it's the loose leaf Pina Colada tea from Point Loma Teas. It is so yummy. This one I always like to say, it reminds me a little bit of having just dried fruit, it's apples, rose hips, pineapple, tropical fruit, and coconut pieces. It smells so good, and I'm going to admit that part of the reason is, actually I'm going to be sneak on this one, because I can see that there's a lot of dark color on the bottom that didn't make it on the top where I'm going to pour. So I'm going to push down the French press and then pull it back up again on the plunger. Whoops, look at that. So that way the color distributes a little bit more, so the dark color's all the way through. Yum. And then we'll go ahead and press that and pour. So let's go ahead and enjoy that tea. Oh, and I was going to say, the reason I wanted to try this tea today, beyond finding it in the cupboard and knowing it's delicious, is that I've been making, at home, I've been making lilikoi butter, which is basically taking passion fruit juice and adding eggs, sugar, and butter to it to make a passion fruit curd. Fabulous, fabulous stuff. But my question for you guys, if anyone else knows, if anyone else likes passion fruit, is once I separate the juice from the pulp and the seeds, what can I do with the seeds? I threw away a batch of it, but I just feel so guilty. I'm trying to figure out what I can do with the passion fruit seeds. So if anyone has some good suggestions for what we can make out of the passion fruit seeds, I'd really appreciate it. In the meantime, let's have some other tropical fruity tea. Smells so good. The coconut scent is so amazing, but you get more of the pineapple taste, I think, when you actually drink that one. Okay, so let's go back to our book, which is really probably more the reason you're here than as to what kind of tea I'm drinking today. Although I'd love to hear what tea you're drinking today. Let's see. But the book is what brings us together. Absolutely. And for the Count of Monte Cristo, yesterday we read 2 chapters. They were the burglary and the hand of God. So in the burglary, in that chapter, the Count of Monte Cristo went to his country home in Auteuil, and he received a mysterious letter saying that there was going to be a burglary that night at his house, and he should really go and find out, or something was going to go on at his house, and he should go. And he thought at first that it was just some fake ploy. He didn't know what was going on, but then he realized, it might involve somebody who he would recognize in particular. In other words, one of the people against whom he's concocted some amazing plot of vengeance. And it was. And so the Count of Monte Cristo went back to his house that night. After having all of his servants leave, he went back with just Ali, and they stealthily got back into the house, and they waited and they waited, and they saw somebody outside, and they saw somebody climbing up and coming into the house. And what he realized eventually was the gentleman who had broken into the house, he thought it was somebody who was going to attack him, but no, it was just somebody breaking into the house for to steal. He realized that the thief was no other than Caderousse, his long ago former friend-ish and everything, whom he may or may not have realized was back in contact with Benedetto. We really don't know all the details about what the Count of Monte Cristo actually realizes. And so, although I tend to think he knows everything, because he's the Count of Monte Cristo. And so, he puts on the disguise of the Abbé Busoni, and he reveals himself to Caderousse. And Caderousse is basically like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize you were going to be here. And he's like, well, you are robbing my friend, the Count of Monte Cristo. He wasn't here, and here I am. And Caderousse basically says, I'm so sorry, Father, I didn't mean to do this terrible thing. I was just so poor. Poverty compelled me to do this thing. And the Abbé Busoni, Edmond Dantes, basically says, poverty is not the issue here. I mean, you had wealth given to you. I gave you wealth. I gave you a large diamond, and yet you chose to commit a crime. It's like, well, really, I didn't want to commit the crime. My wife convinced me to do it. It's like, right, but you did it. And so, so they end up talking, and Caderousse actually tries to stab the Abbé Busoni so he can escape. And the Abbé, the Count of Monte Cristo, is wearing a bit of chainmail underneath his priest's robes. And so the knife is blocked And Caderousse realizes there's no escaping this at this point. And so the Abbé actually tells him, I'm not going to call the police on you. You go. If you manage to make it home, I will take it as a sign that God has forgiven you, and I will forgive you too. And I'll actually send you money. You need to leave Paris after this, but I'll send you money just to help you get by. I'll send you an annuity. So every year he would send him money. And Caderousse doesn't quite believe his good fortune, but he's like, okay, all right. And he goes down the ladder, and he's getting ready to escape when out of the shadows comes somebody else. Stabs him in the back, stabs him in the side, stabs him in the chest. And Caderousse falls stricken to the ground, and the gentleman who stabbed him runs away. He calls for help, and out comes the Abbé Busoni and Ali, who help him back into the house. The Count of Monte Cristo dispatches Ali to go retrieve a surgeon and also to retrieve the Procureur de Roy, the magistrate, Monsieur de Villefort. And while they're all gone, the Abbé Busoni talks more with Caderousse, and Caderousse reveals that the man who stabbed him was Benedetto. And earlier in the first chapter, he had said that, he had met Benedetto when both of them were serving basically as galley slaves. They were being punished for the crimes they had committed. For Caderousse, it was the crime of having killed the jeweler. Benedetto's crime, I'm suddenly blanking on what it was. I feel like it was murder, but maybe I'm getting mixed up with Caderousse. Again, if you remember the crime was, go ahead and post that too. Otherwise, we'll figure it out later. But Benedetto and Caderousse had been chained up together. And then a gentleman, Lord Whitmore, who we also know as the Count of Monte Cristo, had freed them both. And basically, it was just passed off as something capricious that he had wanted to free some people, and he had chosen those two. Although Benedetto was also afterwards given a communication by Lord Whitmore, which told him to get in touch with the Count of Monte Cristo and to present himself as Andrea Cavalcanti. So we know that the Count of Monte Cristo wanted to free Benedetto so that he can have him in the scheme that he's currently enacting. Whether or not Caderousse was intended to be his companion when they were freed, or whether it was just fortune that was the gentleman who was chained to Benedetto, we don't know. I personally would think that he actually wanted to free Caderousse, because I think that the Count of Monte Cristo has tried again and again to give Caderousse chances to do better. This is what the Abbé Busoni says to him, and I believe that this is what the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes, also was trying to do for Caderousse, who was involved in the plot that resulted in Edmond getting imprisoned, but was not as involved with it. He was more of somebody who saw it, who failed to stop it, but didn't actively participate in it. So, what we see then is, in that second chapter, The Hand of God, the Count of Monte Cristo, in the guise of the Abbé Busoni, writes confessions and also a declaration, an accusation against Benedetto, signed by Caderousse. He also speaks with Caderousse about redemption, and that he ought to be asking the pardon of God at this point. And Caderousse says, "There's no God. This is all chance. There's been no hand in this. Things just happened." And the Count of Monte Cristo tells him again and again, there is a force in this. There is a plan in this. And part of his conviction is based on his feeling that he is an angel of God, in that sense that he is trying to work out God's retribution and create justice by balancing the scales for what had been done to him by all these people. And so the Abbé Busoni says these things over and over again to Caderousse, and Caderousse is like, there's just no way. And finally, he's like, you're just such a weird priest. What you're saying doesn't make any sense. Like, who are you? Who are you really? At which point, the Abbé Busoni gets close to Caderousse and whispers in his ear softly a name, which causes Caderousse then to suddenly realize that there has been more than he's realized at work. And he calls out for God's forgiveness. And then he dies. The chapter ends pretty much with the Abbé Busoni, who we know as the Count of Monte Cristo, mysteriously saying the number 1, as in one of these folks has already, justice has been dealt to one of the people who had a hand in the fate of the Count of Monte Cristo so long ago. Dun, dun, dun. I can't help myself. It's really dramatic. And then so Caderousse died, and that was the end of the story of Caderousse, although he did write those confessions and accusations, so we'll see if there is what the further repercussions of that are. We know that there will be something. So today we are going to read 3 chapters. First is short, second is medium, third is just a tiny bit longer. So not that long, but we'll probably hit just over an hour. So I would suggest you get settled in, have something delicious on hand. That is so good. Okay, we're going to read 3 chapters today. Our first chapter, chapter 84, is called Beauchamp. The daring attempt to rob the Count was the topic of conversation throughout Paris for the next fortnight. The dying man had signed a deposition declaring Benedetto to be the assassin. The police had orders to make the strictest search for the murderer. Caderousse's knife, dark lantern, bunch of keys, and clothing, excepting the waistcoat which could not be found, were deposited at the registry. The corpse was conveyed to the morgue. The Count told everyone that this adventure had happened during his absence at Auteuil, and that he only knew what was related by the Abbé Busoni, who that evening, by mere chance, had requested to pass the night in his house to examine some valuable books in his library. Bertuccio alone turned pale whenever Benedetto's name was mentioned in his presence, but there was no reason why anyone should notice his doing so. Villefort, being called on to prove the crime, was preparing his brief with the same ardor that he was accustomed to exercise when required to speak in criminal cases. But 3 weeks had already passed, and the most diligent search had been unsuccessful. The attempted robbery and the murder of the robber by his comrade were almost forgotten in anticipation of the approaching marriage of Mademoiselle Danglars to the Count Andrea Cavalcanti. It was expected that this wedding would shortly take place, as the young man was received at the banker's as the betrothed. Letters had been dispatched to Monsieur Cavalcanti, as the Count's father, who highly approved of the union, regretted his inability to leave Parma at that time, and promised a wedding gift of 150,000 livres. It was agreed that the 3 millions should be entrusted to Danglars to invest. Some persons had warned the young man of the circumstances of his future father-in-law, who had of late sustained repeated losses. But with sublime disinterestedness and confidence the young man refused to listen or to express a single doubt to the Baron. The Baron adored Count Andrea Cavalcanti. Not so Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars. With an instinctive hatred of matrimony, she suffered Andrea's attentions in order to get rid of Morcerf. But when Andrea urged his suit, she betrayed an entire dislike to him. The Baron might possibly have perceived it, but attributing it to a caprice, feigned ignorance. The delay demanded by Beauchamp had nearly expired. Morcerf appreciated the advice of Monte Cristo to let things die away of their own accord. No one had taken up the remark about the general, and no one had recognized in the officer who betrayed the castle of Yanina the noble count in the House of Peers. Albert, however, felt no less insulted. The few lines which had irritated him were certainly intended as an insult. Besides, the manner in which Beauchamp had closed the conference left a bitter recollection in his heart. He cherished the thought of the duel, hoping to conceal its true cause even from his seconds. Beauchamp had not been seen since the day he visited Albert, and those of whom the latter inquired always told him he was out on a journey which would detain him some days. Where he was, no one knew. One morning, Albert was awakened by his valet de chambre, who announced Beauchamp. Albert rubbed his eyes, ordered his servant to introduce him into the small smoking room on the ground floor, dressed himself quickly, and went down. He found Beauchamp pacing the room. On perceiving him, Beauchamp stopped. "Your arrival here, without waiting my visit at your house today, looks well, sir," said Albert. "Tell me, may I shake hands with you, saying, Beauchamp, acknowledge you have injured me and retain my friendship, or must I simply propose to you a choice of arms?" "Albert," said Beauchamp, with a look of sorrow which stupefied the young man, "let us first sit down and talk." "Rather, sir, before we sit down, I must demand your answer." "Albert," said the journalist, "these are questions which it is difficult to answer." I will facilitate it by repeating the question. Will you or will you not retract? Morcerf, it is not enough to answer yes or no to questions which concern the honor, the social interest, and the life of such a man as Lieutenant General, the Count of Morcerf, peer of France. What must then be done? What I have done, Albert, I reasoned thus. Money, time, and fatigue are nothing compared with the reputation and interests of a whole family. Probabilities will not suffice. Only facts will justify a deadly combat with a friend. If I strike with the sword or discharge the contents of a pistol at a man for whom, for 3 years, I have been on terms of intimacy, I must at least know why I do so. I must meet him with a heart at ease and that quiet conscience which a man needs when his own arm must save his life. Well, said Morcerf impatiently, what does all this mean? It means that I have just returned from Yanina. From Yanina? Yes. Impossible! Here is my passport. Examine the visa. Geneva, Milan, Venice, Trieste, Delvino, Yanina. Will you believe the government of a republic, a kingdom, and an empire? Albert cast his eyes on the passport, then raised them in astonishment to Beauchamp. You have been to Yanina, said he. Albert, had you been a stranger, a foreigner, a simple lord, like that Englishman who came to demand satisfaction 3 or 4 months since, and whom I killed to get rid of, I should not have taken this trouble. But I thought this mark of consideration due to you. I took a week to go, another to return, 4 days of quarantine, and 48 hours to stay there. That makes 3 weeks. I returned last night, and here I am. What circumlocution! How long you are before you tell me what I most wish to know? Because, in truth, Albert, you hesitate? Yes, I fear. You fear to acknowledge that your correspondent has deceived you? Oh, no self-love, Beauchamp. Acknowledge it, Beauchamp. Your courage cannot be doubted. Not so, murmured the journalist. On the contrary... Albert turned frightfully pale. He endeavored to speak, but the words died on his lips. My friend, said Beauchamp in the most affectionate tone, I should gladly make an apology, but alas... But what? The paragraph was correct, my friend. What? That French officer? Yes. Fernand? Yes. The traitor who surrendered the castle of the man in whose service he was. Pardon me, my friend. That man was your father. Albert advanced furiously towards Beauchamp, but the latter restrained him more by a mild look than by his extended hand. My friend, said he, here is a proof of it. Albert opened the paper. It was an attestation of 4 notable inhabitants of Yanina, proving that Colonel Fernand Mondego, in the service of Ali Tepelini, had surrendered the castle for 2 million crowns. The signatures were perfectly legal. Albert tottered and fell, overpowered in a chair. It could no longer be doubted. The family name was fully given. After a moment's mournful silence, his heart overflowed, and he gave way to a flood of tears. Beauchamp, who had watched with sincere pity the young man's paroxysm of grief, approached him. Now, Albert, said he, you understand me, do you not? I wished to see all, and to judge of everything for myself, hoping that explanation would be in your father's favor, and that I might do him justice. But, on the contrary, the particulars which are given prove that Fernand Mondego, raised by Ali Pasha to the rank of Governor-General, is no other than Count Fernand of Morcerf. Then, recollecting the honor you had done me in admitting me to your friendship, I hastened to you. Albert, still extended on the chair, covered his face with both hands, as if to prevent the light from reaching him. I hastened to you, continued Beauchamp, to tell you, Albert, that in this changing age, the faults of a father cannot revert upon his children. Few have passed through this revolutionary period, in the midst of which we were born, without some stain of infamy or blood to soil the uniform of the soldier or the gown of the magistrate. Now I have these proofs, Albert, and I am in your confidence. No human power can force me to a duel which your own conscience would reproach you with as criminal. But I come to offer you what you can no longer demand of me. Do you wish these proofs, these attestations, which I alone possess, to be destroyed? Do you wish this frightful secret to remain with us? Confided to me, it shall never escape my lips. Say, Albert, my friend, do you wish it? Albert threw himself on Beauchamp's neck. Ah, noble fellow, cried he. Take these, said Beauchamp, presenting the papers to Albert. Albert seized them with a convulsive hand, tore them in pieces, and trembling lest the least vestige should escape and one day appear to confront him, he approached the wax light, always kept burning for cigars, and burned every fragment. Dear, excellent friend, murmured Albert, still burning the papers. Let all be forgotten as a sorrowful dream, said Beauchamp. Let it vanish as the last sparks from the blackened paper, and disappear as the smoke from those silent ashes. Yes, yes, said Albert, and may there remain only the eternal friendship which I promised to my deliverer, which should be transmitted to our children's children, and shall always remind me that I owe my life and the honor of my name to you. For had this been known, oh, Beauchamp, I should have destroyed myself. Or, no, my poor mother, I could not have killed her by the same blow. I should have fled from my country. Dear Albert, said Beauchamp, but this sudden and factitious joy soon forsook the young man, and was succeeded by a still greater grief. Well, said Beauchamp, what still oppresses you, my friend? I am broken-hearted, said Albert. Listen, Beauchamp, I cannot thus, in a moment, relinquish the respect, the confidence, and pride with which a father's untarnished name inspires a son. Oh, Beauchamp, Beauchamp, how shall I now approach mine? Shall I draw back my forehead from his embrace, or withhold my hand from his? I am the most wretched of men. Ah, my mother, my poor mother, said Albert, gazing through his tears at his mother's portrait. If you know this, how much must you suffer? Come, said Beauchamp, taking both his hands. Take courage, my friend. But how came that first note to be inserted in your journal? Some unknown enemy, an invisible foe, has done this. The more must you fortify yourself, Albert. Let no trace of emotion be visible on your countenance. Bear your grief as the cloud bears within it ruin and death, a fatal secret known only when the storm bursts. Go, my friend, reserve your strength for the moment when the crash shall come. You think then all is not over yet? Said Albert, horror-stricken. I think nothing, my friend, but all things are possible. By the way, what? Said Albert, seeing that Beauchamp hesitated. Are you going to marry Mademoiselle Danglars? Why do you ask me now? Because the rupture or fulfillment of this engagement is connected with the person of whom we were speaking. How? Said Albert, whose brow reddened. You think Monsieur Danglars? I ask you only how your engagement stands. Pray put no construction on my words I do not mean they should convey, and give them no undue weight. No, said Albert, the engagement is broken off. Well, said Beauchamp, then seeing the young man was about to relapse into melancholy, let us go out, Albert, said he. A ride in the wood in the phaeton, or on horseback, will refresh you. We will then return to breakfast, and you shall attend to your affairs, and I to mine. Willingly, said Albert, but let us walk. I think a little exertion would do me good. The two friends walked out on the fortress. When they arrived at the Madeleine, since we are out, said Beauchamp, let us call on Monsieur de Monte Cristo. He is admirably adapted to revive one's spirits because he never interrogates, and in my opinion, those who ask no questions are the best comforters. Gladly, said Albert, let us call. I love him. Chapter 85, The Journey. Monte Cristo uttered a joyful exclamation on seeing the young men together. "Aha," said he. "I hope all is over, explained, and settled." "Yes," said Beauchamp. "The absurd reports have died away, and should they be renewed, I would be the first to oppose them. So let us speak no more of it." "Albert will tell you," replied the Count, "that I gave him the same advice. Look," added he, "I am finishing the most execrable morning's work." "What is it?" said Albert. "Arranging your papers, apparently." "My papers? Thank God, no. My papers are all in capital order, because I have none. But Monsieur Cavalcanti's." "Monsieur Cavalcanti's?" asked Beauchamp. "Yes. Do you not know that this is a young man whom the Count is introducing?" said Morcerf. "Let us not misunderstand each other," replied Monte Cristo. "I introduce no one, and certainly not Monsieur Cavalcanti." "And who," said Albert with a forced smile, "is to marry Mademoiselle Danglars instead of me, which grieves me cruelly." "What? Cavalcanti is going to marry Mademoiselle Danglars?" asked Beauchamp. "Certainly. Do you come from the end of the world?" said Monte Cristo. "You, a journalist, the husband of renown? It is the talk of all Paris." "And you, Count, have made this match?" asked Beauchamp. "I? Silence, purveyor of gossip. Do not spread that report. I make a match? No, you do not know me. I have done all in my power to oppose it." "Ah, I understand," said Beauchamp. "On our friend Albert's account?" "On my account?" said the young man. "Oh, no, indeed. The Count will do me the justice to assert that I have, on the contrary, always entreated him to break off my engagement, and happily it is ended. The Count pretends I have not him to thank. So be it. I will erect an altar Deo ignato." "Listen," said Monte Cristo. "I have had little to do with it, for I am at variance both with the father-in-law and the young man. There is only Mademoiselle Eugénie, who appears but little charmed with the thoughts of matrimony, and who, seeing how little I was disposed to persuade her to renounce her dear liberty, retains any affection for me." "And do you say this wedding is at hand?" "Oh, yes, in spite of all I could say. I do not know the young man. He is said to be of good family and rich, but I never trust to vague assertions. I have warned Monsieur Danglars of it till I am tired, but he is fascinated with his Lucanese. I have even informed him of a circumstance I consider very serious. The young man was either charmed by his nurse, stolen by gypsies, or lost by his tutor. I scarcely know which. But I do know his father lost sight of him for more than 10 years. What he did during those 10 years, God only knows. Well, all that was useless. They have commissioned me to write to the major to demand papers, and here they are. I send them, but like Pilate, washing my hands." "And what does Mademoiselle d'Armilly say to you for robbing her of her pupil?" "Oh, well, I don't know, but I understand that she is going to Italy. Madame Danglars asked me for letters of recommendation for the impresarii. I gave her a few lines for the director of the Valle Theatre, who is under some obligation to me. But what is the matter, Albert? You look dull. Are you, after all, unconsciously in love with Mademoiselle Eugénie?" "I am not aware of it," said Albert, smiling sorrowfully. Beauchamp turned to look at some paintings. "But," continued Monte Cristo, "you are not in your usual spirits." "I have a dreadful headache," said Albert. "Well, my dear Viscount," said Monte Cristo, "I have an infallible remedy to propose to you." "What is it?" asked the young man. "A change." "Indeed," said Albert. "Yes, and as I am just now excessively annoyed, I shall go from home. Shall we go together?" "You annoyed, Count," said Beauchamp, "and by what?" "Ah, you think very lightly of it. I should like to see you with the brief preparing in your house." "What brief?" "The one Monsieur de Villefort is preparing against my amiable assassin. Some brigand escaped from the gallows, apparently." "True," said Beauchamp. "I saw it in the papers. Who is this Caderousse?" "Some Provençal, it appears. Monsieur de Villefort heard of him at Marseille, and Monsieur Danglars recollects having seen him. Consequently, the procureur is very active in the affair, and the prefect of police very much interested, and thanks to that interest, for which I am very grateful, They send me all the robbers of Paris and the neighborhood, under pretense of their being Caderousse's murderers, so that in 3 months, if this continues, every robber and assassin in France will have the plan of my house at his fingers' ends. I am resolved to desert them and go to some remote corner of the earth, and shall be happy if you will accompany me, Viscount. Willingly. Then it is settled? Yes, but where? I have told you, where the air is pure, where every sound soothes, where one is sure to be humbled, however proud may be his nature. I love that humiliation. I, who am master of the universe, as was Augustus. But where are you really going? To sea, Viscount. You know I am a sailor. I was rocked when an infant in the arms of old ocean and on the bosom of the beautiful Amphitrite. I've sported with the green mantle of the one and the azure robe of the other. I love the sea as a mistress, and pine if I do not often see her. Let us go, Count. To sea? Yes. You accept my proposal? I do. Well, Viscount, there will be in my courtyard this evening a good traveling britska, with 4 post horses, in which one may rest as in a bed. Monsieur Beauchamp, it holds 4 very well. Will you accompany us? Thank you, I have just returned from sea. What? You have been to sea? Yes, I have just made a little excursion to the Borromean Islands. What of that? Come with us, said Albert. No, dear Morcerf, you know I only refuse when the thing is impossible. Besides, it is important, added he in a low tone, that I should remain in Paris just now to watch the paper. Ah, you are a good and an excellent friend, said Albert. Yes, you are right. Watch, Beauchamp, and try to discover the enemy who made this disclosure. Albert and Beauchamp parted, the last pressure of their hands expressing what their tongues could not before a stranger. Beauchamp is a worthy fellow, said Monte Cristo when the journalist was gone. Is he not, Albert? Yes, and a sincere friend. I love him devotedly. But now we are alone, although it is immaterial to me. Where are we going? Into Normandy, if you like. Delightful. Shall we be quite retired? Have no society, no neighbors? Our companions will be riding horses, dogs to hunt with, and a fishing boat. Exactly what I wish for. I will apprise my mother of my intention and return to you. But shall you be allowed to go into Normandy? I may go where I please. Yes, I am aware you may go alone, since I once met you in Italy. But to accompany the mysterious Monte Cristo? You forget, Count, that I have often told you of the deep interest my mother takes in you. Woman is fickle, said Francis I. Woman is like a wave of the sea, said Shakespeare. Both the great king and the great poet ought to have known woman's nature well. Woman's, yes. My mother is not woman, but a woman. As I am only a humble foreigner, you must pardon me if I do not understand all the subtle refinements of your language. What I mean to say is that my mother is not quick to give her confidence, but when she does, she never changes. Ah, yes, indeed, said Monte Cristo with a sigh. And do you think she is in the least interested in me? I repeat it, you must really be a very strange and superior man, for my mother is so absorbed by the interest you have excited that when I'm with her she speaks of no one else. And does she try to make you dislike me? On the contrary, she often says, Morcerf, I believe the Count has a noble nature. Try to gain his esteem. Indeed, said Monte Cristo, sighing. You see, then, said Albert, that instead of opposing, she will encourage me. Adieu, then, until 5 o'clock. Be punctual, and we shall arrive at 12 or 1. At Tréport? Yes, or in the neighborhood. But can we travel 48 leagues in 8 hours? Easily, said Monte Cristo. You are certainly a prodigy. You will soon not only surpass the railway, which would not be very difficult in France, but even the telegraph. But, Viscount, since we cannot perform the journey in less than 7 or 8 hours, do not keep me waiting. Do not fear, I have little to prepare. Monte Cristo smiled as he nodded to Albert, then remained a moment absorbed in deep meditation. But passing a hand across his forehead as if to dispel his reverie, He rang the bell twice, and Bertuccio entered. "Bertuccio," said he, "I intend going this evening to Normandy instead of tomorrow or the next day. You will have sufficient time before 5 o'clock. Dispatch a messenger to apprise the grooms at the first station. Monsieur de Morcerf will accompany me." Bertuccio obeyed and dispatched a courier to Pontoise to say the traveling carriage would arrive at 6 o'clock. From Pontoise, another express was sent to the next stage, and in 6 hours all the horses stationed on the road were ready. Before his departure, the Count went to Haydée's apartments, told her his intention, and resigned everything to her care. Albert was punctual. The journey soon became interesting from its rapidity, of which Morcerf had formed no previous idea. "Truly," said Monte Cristo, "with your post-horses going at the rate of 2 leagues an hour, and the absurd law that one traveler shall not pass another without permission, so that an invalid or ill-tempered traveler may detain those who are well and active, it is impossible to move. I escape this annoyance by traveling with my own postilion and horses. Do I not, Ali?" The Count put his head out of the window and whistled, and the horses appeared to fly. The carriage rolled with a thundering noise over the pavement, and everyone turned to notice the dazzling meteor. Ali, smiling, repeated the sound, grasped the reins with a firm hand, and spurred his horses, whose beautiful manes floated in the breeze. This child of the desert was in his element, and with his black face and sparkling eyes appeared, in the cloud of dust he raised, like the genius of the simoom and the god of the hurricane. "I never knew till now the delight of speed," said Morcerf, and the last cloud disappeared from his brow. "But where the devil do you get such horses? Are they made to order?" "Precisely," said the Count. 6 years since, I bought a horse in Hungary remarkable for its swiftness. The 32 that we shall use tonight are its progeny. They are all entirely black, with the exception of a star upon the forehead." "That is perfectly admirable. But what do you do, Count, with all these horses?" "You see, I travel with them." "But you are not always traveling." "When I no longer require them, Bertuccio will sell them, and he expects to realize 30 or 40,000 francs by the sale." "But no monarch in Europe would be wealthy enough to purchase them." "Then he will sell them to some Eastern vizier, who will empty his coffers to purchase them, and refill them by applying the bastinado to his subjects." "Count, may I suggest one idea to you?" "Certainly." "It is that, next to you, Bertuccio must be the richest gentleman in Europe." "You are mistaken, Viscount. I believe he has not a franc in his possession." "And then he must be a wonder. My dear Count, if you tell me many more marvelous things, I warn you I shall not believe them." "I countenance nothing that is not marvelous, Monsieur Albert. Tell me, why does a steward rob his master?" "Because I suppose it is his nature to do so, for the love of robbing." "You are mistaken. It is because he has a wife and family, and ambitious desires for himself and them. Also, because he is not sure of always retaining his situation, and wishes to provide for the future. Now, Monsieur Bertuccio is alone in the world. He uses my property without accounting for the use he makes of it. He is sure never to leave my service." "Why?" "Because I should never get a better." "Probabilities are deceptive." "But I deal in certainties. He is the best servant over whom one has the power of life and death." "Do you possess that right over Bertuccio?" "Yes." There are words which close a conversation with an iron door. Such was the Count's yes. The whole journey was performed with equal rapidity. The 32 horses, dispatched over 7 stages, brought them to their destination in 8 hours. At midnight they arrived at the gate of a beautiful park. The porter was in attendance. He had been apprised by the groom of the last stage of the Count's approach. At 2:30 in the morning, Morcerf was conducted to his apartments, where a bath and supper were prepared. The servant who had traveled at the back of the carriage waited on him. Baptistine, who rode in front, attended the Count. Albert bathed, took his supper, and went to bed. All night he was lulled by the melancholy noise of the surf. On rising, he went to his window, which opened on a terrace, having the sea in front, and at the back a pretty park bounded by a small forest. In a creek lay a little sloop with a narrow keel and high masts, bearing on its flag the Monte Cristo arms, which were a mountain or on a sea azure, with the cross gules in chief, which might be an allusion to his name that recalled Calvary, the mount rendered by our Lord's passion more precious than gold, and to the degrading cross which his blood had rendered holy. Or it might be some personal remembrance of suffering and regeneration buried in the night of this mysterious personage's past life. Around the schooner lay a number of small fishing boats belonging to the fishermen of the neighboring village, like humble subjects awaiting orders from their queen. There, as in every spot where Monte Cristo stopped, if but for 2 days, luxury abounded, and life went on with the utmost ease. Albert found in his anteroom 2 guns, with all the accoutrement for hunting, a lofty room on the ground floor containing all the ingenious instruments the English, eminent in piscatory pursuits, since they are patient and sluggish, have invented for fishing. The day passed in pursuing these exercises in which Monte Cristo excelled. They killed a dozen pheasants in the park, as many trout in the stream, dined in a summer house overlooking the ocean, and took tea in the library. Towards the evening of the 3rd day, Albert, completely exhausted with the exercise which invigorated Monte Cristo, was sleeping in an armchair near the window, while the Count was designing with his architect the plan of a conservatory in his house, when the sound of a horse at full speed on the high road made Albert look up. He was disagreeably surprised to see his own valet de chambre, whom he had not brought, that he might not inconvenience Monte Cristo. "Florentine here!" cried he, starting up. "Is my mother ill?" And he hastened to the door. Monte Cristo watched and saw him approach the valet, who drew a small sealed parcel from his pocket, containing a newspaper and a letter. "From whom is this?" said he eagerly. "From Monsieur Beauchamp," replied Florentine. "Did he send you?" "Yes, sir. He sent for me to his house, gave me money for my journey, procured a horse, and made me promise not to stop till I had reached you. I have come in 15 hours. Albert opened the letter with fear, uttered a shriek on reading the first line, and seized the paper. His sight was dimmed, his legs sank under him, and he would have fallen had not Florentine supported him. "Poor young man," said Monte Cristo in a low voice. "It is then true that the sin of the father shall fall on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation." Meanwhile Albert had revived, and continuing to read, he threw back his head, saying, "Florentine, is your horse fit to return immediately?" "It is a poor, lame post-horse." "In what state was the house when you left?" "All was quiet, but on returning from Monsieur Beauchamp's, I found Madame in tears. She had sent for me to know when you would return. I told her my orders from Monsieur Beauchamp. She first extended her arms to prevent me, but after a moment's reflection, 'Yes, go, Florentine,' said she, 'and may he come quickly.'" "Yes, my mother," said Albert, "I will return, and woe to the infamous wretch. But first of all, I must get there." He went back to the room where he had left Monte Cristo. 5 minutes had sufficed to make a complete transformation in his appearance. His voice had become rough and hoarse, his face was furrowed with wrinkles, his eyes burned under the blue-veined lids, and he tottered like a drunken man. "Count," said he, "I thank you for your hospitality, which I would gladly have enjoyed longer, but I must return to Paris." "What has happened?" "A great misfortune, more important to me than life. Don't question me, I beg of you, but lend me a horse." "My stables are at your command, Viscount, but you will kill yourself by riding on horseback. Take a post-chaise or a carriage." "No, it would delay me, and I need the fatigue you warn me of. It will do me good." Albert reeled as if he had been shot, and fell on a chair near the door. Monte Cristo did not see this second manifestation of physical exhaustion. He was at the window calling, "Ali, a horse for Monsieur de Morcerf! Quick! He is in a hurry." These words restored Albert. He darted from the room, followed by the Count. "Thank you," cried he, throwing himself on his horse. "Return as soon as you can, Florentine. Must I use any password to procure a horse?" "Only dismount. Another will be immediately saddled." Albert hesitated a moment. "You may think my departure strange and foolish," said the young man, You do not know how a paragraph in a newspaper may exasperate one. Read that, said he, when I am gone, that you may not be witness of my anger. While the Count picked up the paper, he put spurs to his horse, which leapt in astonishment at such an unusual stimulus, and shot away with the rapidity of an arrow. The Count watched him with a feeling of compassion, and when he had completely disappeared, read as follows. The French officer in the service of Ali Pasha of Yanina, alluded to 3 weeks since in Lamparchal, who not only surrendered the castle of Yanina, but sold his benefactor to the Turks, styled himself truly at that name Fernand, as our esteemed contemporary states, but he has since added to his Christian name a title of nobility and a family name. He now calls himself the Count of Morcerf, and ranks among the peers. Thus the terrible secret, which Beauchamp has so generously destroyed, appeared again like an armed phantom, and another paper, deriving its information from some malicious source, had published 2 days after Albert's departure for Normandy the few lines which had rendered the unfortunate young man almost crazy. And now, chapter 86, The Trial. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Albert had arrived at Beauchamp's door. The valet de chambre had received orders to usher him in at once. Beauchamp was in his bath. "Here I am," Albert said. "Well, my poor friend," replied Beauchamp, "I expected you. I need not say I think you are too faithful and too kind to have spoken of that painful circumstance. Your having sent for me is another proof of your affection. So, without losing time, tell me, have you the slightest idea whence this terrible blow proceeds?" "I think I have some clue." "But first, tell me all the particulars of this shameful plot." Beauchamp proceeded to relate to the young man, who was overwhelmed with shame and grief, the following facts. 2 days previously, the article had appeared in another paper besides L'Impartial, and what was more serious, one that was well known as a government paper. Beauchamp was breakfasting when he read the paragraph. He sent immediately for a cabriolet and hastened to the publisher's office. Although professing diametrically opposite principles from those of the editor of the other paper, Beauchamp, as it sometimes, we may say often happens, was his intimate friend. The editor was reading with apparent delight a leading article in the same paper on beet sugar, probably a composition of his own. "Ah, pardieu," said Beauchamp, "with the paper in your hand, my friend, I need not tell you the cause of my visit." "Are you interested in the sugar question?" asked the editor of the ministerial paper. "No," replied Beauchamp, "I have not considered the question. A totally different subject interests me." "What is it?" "The article relative to Morcerf." "Indeed? Is it not a curious affair?" "So curious that I think you are running a great risk of a prosecution for defamation of character." "Not at all. We have received with the information all the requisite proofs, and we are quite sure Monsieur de Morcerf will not raise his voice against us. Besides, it is rendering a service to one's country to denounce these wretched criminals who are unworthy of the honor bestowed on them." Beauchamp was thunderstruck. "Who, then, has so correctly informed you?" asked he, "for my paper, which gave the first information on the subject, has been obliged to stop for want of proof. And yet we are more interested than you in exposing Monsieur de Morcerf, as he is a peer of France, and we are of the opposition." "Oh, that is very simple. We have not sought to scandalize. This news was brought to us. A man arrived yesterday from Yanina, bringing a formidable array of documents, and when we hesitated to publish the accusatory article, he told us it should be inserted in some other paper." Beauchamp understood that nothing remained but to submit, and left the office to dispatch a courier to Morcerf. But he had been unable to send to Albert the following particulars, as the events had transpired after the messenger's departure. Namely, that the same day a great agitation was manifest in the House of Peers among the usually calm members of that dignified assembly. Everyone had arrived almost before the usual hour, and was conversing on the melancholy event which was to attract the attention of the public towards one of their most illustrious colleagues. Some were perusing the article, others making comments and recalling circumstances which substantiated the charges still more. The Count of Morcerf was no favorite with his colleagues. Like all upstarts, He had had recourse to a great deal of haughtiness to maintain his position. The true nobility laughed at him, the talented repelled him, and the honorable instinctively despised him. He was, in fact, in the unhappy position of the victim marked for sacrifice. The finger of God once pointed at him, everyone was prepared to raise the hue and cry. The Count of Morcerf alone was ignorant of the news. He did not take in the paper containing the defamatory article, and had passed the morning in writing letters and in trying a horse. He arrived at his usual hour with a proud look and insolent demeanor. He alighted, passed through the corridors, and entered the house without observing the hesitation of the doorkeepers or the coolness of his colleagues. Business had already been going on for half an hour when he entered. Everyone held the accusing paper, but as usual, no one liked to take upon himself the responsibility of the attack. At length an honorable peer, Morcerf's acknowledged enemy, ascended the tribune with that solemnity which announced that the expected moment had arrived. There was an impressive silence. Morcerf alone knew not why such profound attention was given to an orator who was not always listened to with so much complacency. The Count did not notice the introduction, in which the speaker announced that his communication would be of vital importance, that it demanded the undivided attention of the House. But at the mention of Yanina and Colonel Fernand, he turned so frightfully pale that every member shuddered and fixed his eyes upon him. Moral wounds have this peculiarity. They may be hidden, but they never close. Always painful, always ready to bleed when touched, they remain fresh and open in the heart. The article having been read during the painful hush that followed, a universal shudder pervaded the assembly, and immediately the closest attention was given to the orator as he resumed his remarks. He stated his scruples and the difficulties of the case. It was the honor of Monsieur de Morcerf and that of the whole house he proposed to defend, by provoking a debate on personal questions, which are always such painful themes of discussion. He concluded by calling for an investigation which might dispose of the calumnious report before it had time to spread, and restore Monsieur de Morcerf to the position he had long held in public opinion. Morcerf was so completely overwhelmed by this great and unexpected calamity that he could scarcely stammer a few words as he looked around on the assembly. This timidity, which might proceed from the astonishment of innocence as well as the shame of guilt, conciliated some in his favor. For men who are truly generous are always ready to compassionate when the misfortune of their enemy surpasses the limits of their hatred. The president put it to a vote, and it was decided that the investigation should take place. The Count was asked what time he required to prepare his defense. Morcerf's courage had revived when he found himself alive after this horrible blow. "My lords," answered he, "it is not by time I could repel the attack made on me by enemies unknown to me, and doubtless hidden in obscurity. It is immediately and by a thunderbolt that I must repel the flash of lightning which, for a moment, startled me. Oh, that I could, instead of taking up this defense, shed my last drop of blood to prove to my noble colleagues that I am their equal in worth." These words made a favorable impression on behalf of the accused. "I demand, then, that the examination shall take place as soon as possible, and I will furnish the House with all necessary information." "What day do you fix?" asked the president. "Today I am at your service," replied the Count. The president rang the bell. "Does the House approve that the examination should take place today?" "Yes," was the unanimous answer. A committee of 12 members was chosen to examine the proofs brought forward by Morcerf. The investigation would begin at 8 o'clock that evening in the committee room, and if postponement were necessary, the proceedings would be resumed each evening at the same hour. Morcerf asked leave to retire. He had to collect the documents he had long been preparing against this storm, which his sagacity had foreseen. Beauchamp related to the young man all the facts we have just narrated. His story, however, had over ours all the advantage of the animation of living things over the coldness of dead things. Albert listened, trembling now with hope, then with anger, and then again with shame. For from Beauchamp's confidence he knew his father was guilty, and he asked himself how, since he was guilty, he could prove his innocence. Beauchamp hesitated to continue his narrative. "What next?" asked Albert. "What next? My friend, you impose a painful task on me. Must you know all?" "Absolutely, and rather from your lips than another's." "Muster up all your courage, then, for never have you required it more." Albert passed his hand over his forehead as if to try his strength, as a man who is preparing to defend his life proves his shield and bends his sword. He thought himself strong enough, for he mistook fever for energy. "Go on," said he. The evening arrived. All Paris was in expectation. Many said your father had only to show himself to crush the charge against him. Many others said he would not appear, while some asserted that they had seen him start for Brussels, and others went to the police office to inquire if he had taken out a passport. I used all my influence with one of the committee, a young peer of my acquaintance, to get admission to one of the galleries. He called for me at 7 o'clock, and before anyone had arrived, asked one of the doorkeepers to place me in a box. I was concealed by a column, and might witness the whole of the terrible scene which was about to take place. At 8 o'clock all were in their places, and Monsieur de Morcerf entered at the last stroke. He held some papers in his hand. His countenance was calm and his step firm, and he was dressed with great care in his military uniform, which was buttoned completely up to the chin. His presence produced a good effect. The committee was made up of liberals, several of whom came forward to shake hands with him. Albert felt his heart bursting at these particulars, but gratitude mingled with his sorrow. He would gladly have embraced those who had given his father this proof of esteem at a moment when his honor was so powerfully attacked. At this moment, one of the doorkeepers brought in a letter for the president. "You are at liberty to speak, Monsieur de Morcerf," said the president as he unsealed the letter, and the count began his defense. "I assure you, Albert, in a most eloquent and skillful manner." He produced documents proving that the vizier of Yanina had up to the last moment honored him with his entire confidence, since he had interested him with a negotiation of life and death with the emperor. He produced the ring, his mark of authority, with which Ali Pasha generally sealed his letters, and which the latter had given him, that he might, on his return at any hour of the day or night, gain access to the presence, even in the harem. Unfortunately, the negotiation failed, and when he returned to defend his benefactor, he was dead. "But," said the count, "so great was Ali Pasha's confidence that on his deathbed he resigned his favorite mistress and her daughter to my care." Albert started on hearing these words. The history of Haydée recurred to him, and he remembered what she had said of that message and the ring, and the manner in which she had been sold and made a slave. "And what effect did this discourse produce?" anxiously inquired Albert. "I acknowledge it affected me, and indeed all the committee also," said Beauchamp. Meanwhile, the president carelessly opened the letter which had been brought to him, but the first lines aroused his attention. He read them again, and fixing his eyes on Monsieur de Morcerf, "Count," said he, "you have said that the vizier of Yanina confided his wife and daughter to your care?" "Yes, sir," replied Morcerf, "but in that, like all the rest, misfortune pursued me. On my return, Vasiliki and her daughter Haydée had disappeared." "Did you know them?" "My intimacy with the Pasha and his unlimited confidence had gained me an introduction to them, and I had seen them above 20 times." "Have you any idea what became of them?" "Yes, sir, I heard they had fallen victims to their sorrow and perhaps to their poverty. I was not rich. My life was in constant danger. I could not seek them, to my great regret." The president frowned imperceptibly. "Gentlemen," said he, "you have heard the Comte de Morcerf's defense. Can you, sir, produce any witnesses to the truth of what you have asserted?" "Alas, no, monsieur," replied the count. "All those who surrounded the vizier, or who knew me at his court, are either dead or gone away. I know not where. I believe that I alone, of all my countrymen, survived that dreadful war. I have only the letters of Ali Tepelini, which I have placed before you, the ring, a token of his goodwill, which is here, and lastly, the most convincing proof I can offer, after an anonymous attack, and that is the absence of any witness against my veracity and the purity of my military life." A murmur of approbation ran through the assembly, and at this moment, Albert, had nothing more transpired, your father's cause had been gained. It only remained to put it to the vote, when the president resumed, "Gentlemen, and you, monsieur, you will not be displeased, I presume, to listen to one who calls himself a very important witness, and who has just presented himself. He is doubtless come to prove the perfect innocence of our colleague. Here is a letter I have just received on the subject. Shall it be read, or shall it be passed over? And shall we take no notice of this incident?" Monsieur de Morcerf turned pale, and clenched his hands on the papers he held. The committee decided to hear the letter. The Count was thoughtful and silent. The President read, Mr. President, I can furnish the Committee of Inquiry into the conduct of the Lieutenant General, the Count of Morcerf, in Epirus and in Macedonia, with important particulars." The President paused, and the Count turned pale. The President looked at his auditors. "Proceed," was heard on all sides. The President resumed, "I was on the spot at the death of Ali Pasha. I was present during his last moments. I know what is become of Vasiliki and Ide. I am at the command of the committee, and even claim the honor of being heard. I shall be in the lobby when this note is delivered to you." "And who is this witness, or rather this enemy?" asked the Count, in a tone in which there was a visible alteration. "We shall know, sir," replied the President. "Is the committee willing to hear this witness?" "Yes, yes," they all said at once. The doorkeeper was called. "Is there anyone in the lobby?" said the President. "Yes, sir." "Who is it?" "A woman, accompanied by a servant." Everyone looked at his neighbor. "Bring him in, or bring her in," said the President. 5 minutes after the doorkeeper again appeared. All eyes were fixed on the door, and I, said Beauchamp, shared the general expectation and anxiety. Behind the doorkeeper walked a woman enveloped in a large veil, which completely concealed her. It was evident from her figure and the perfumes she had about her that she was young and fastidious in her tastes, but that was all. The President requested her to throw aside her veil, and it was then seen that she was dressed in the Grecian costume, and she was remarkably beautiful. "Ah," said Albert, "it was she." "Who?" "Ide." "Who told you that?" "Alas, I guess it. But go on, Beauchamp. You see I am calm and strong, and yet we must be drawing near the disclosure." Monsieur de Morcerf, continued Beauchamp, looked at this woman with surprise and terror. Her lips were about to pass his sentence of life or death. To the committee, the adventure was so extraordinary and curious that the interest they had felt for the Count's safety became now quite a secondary matter. The President himself advanced to place a seat for the young lady, but she declined, availing herself of it. As for the Count, he had fallen on his chair. It was evident that his legs refused to support him. "Madame," said the President, "you have engaged to furnish the committee with some important particulars regarding the affair at Yanina, and you have stated that you were an eyewitness of the event." "I was indeed," said the stranger, with a tone of sweet melancholy and with a sonorous voice peculiar to the East. "But allow me to say that you must have been very young then." "I was 4 years old, but as those events deeply concerned me, not a single detail has escaped my memory." "In what manner could these events concern you, and who are you that they should have made so deep an impression on you?" "On them depended my father's life," replied she. "I am Ide, the daughter of Ali Tepelini, Pasha of Yanina, and of Vasiliki, his beloved wife." The blush of mingled pride and modesty which suddenly suffused the cheeks of the young woman, the brilliancy of her eye, and her highly important communication, produced an indescribable effect on the assembly. As for the Count, he could not have been more overwhelmed if a thunderbolt had fallen at his feet and opened an immense gulf before him. "Madame," replied the President, bowing with profound respect, "allow me to ask one question. It shall be the last. Can you prove the authenticity of what you have now stated?" "I can, sir," said Ide, drawing from under her veil a satin satchel highly perfumed. For here is the register of my birth, signed by my father and his principal officers, and that of my baptism, my father having consented to my being brought up in my mother's faith. This latter has been sealed by the Grand Primate of Macedonia and Epirus. And lastly, and perhaps the most important, the record of the sale of my person and that of my mother to the Armenian merchant El Kobir by the French officer, who, in his infamous bargain with the Porte, had reserved as his part of the booty the wife and daughter of his benefactor, whom he sold for the sum of 400,000 francs. A greenish pallor spread over the Count's cheeks, and his eyes became bloodshot at these terrible imputations, which were listened to by the assembly with ominous silence. Haydée, still calm, but with a calmness more dreadful than the anger of another would have been, handed to the president the record of her sale, written in Arabic. It had been supposed some of the papers might be in the Arabian, Romaic, or Turkish language, and the interpreter of the house was in attendance. One of the noble peers, who was familiar with the Arabic language, having studied it during the famous Egyptian campaign, followed with his eye as the translator read aloud, I, El Kobir, a slave merchant and purveyor of the harem of His Highness, acknowledge having received for transmission to the Sublime Emperor from the French lord, the Count of Monte Cristo, an emerald valued at 800,000 francs, as the ransom of a young Christian slave of 11 years of age, named Haydée, the acknowledged daughter of the late Lord Ali Tepelini, Pasha of Yanina, and of Vasiliki, his favorite. She having been sold to me 7 years previously with her mother, who had died on arriving at Constantinople, by a French colonel in the service of the Vizier Ali Tepelini, named Fernand Mondego. The above-mentioned purchase was made on His Highness's account, whose mandate I had for the sum of 400,000 francs. Given at Constantinople by authority of His Highness in the year 1247 of the Hejira. Signed, El Kobir. That this record should have all due authority, it shall bear the imperial seal, which the vendor is bound to have affixed to it. Near the merchant's signature there was indeed the seal of the Sublime Emperor. A dreadful silence followed the reading of this document. The Count could only stare, and his gaze, fixed as if unconsciously on Haydée, seemed one of fire and blood. Madame, said the president, may reference be made to the Count of Monte Cristo, who is now, I believe, in Paris? Sir, replied Haydée, the Count of Monte Cristo, my foster father, has been in Normandy the last 3 days. Who, then, has counseled you to take this step, one for which the court is deeply indebted to you, and which is perfectly natural, considering your birth and your misfortunes? Sir, replied Haydée, I have been led to take this step from a feeling of respect and grief. Although a Christian, may God forgive me, I have always sought to revenge my illustrious father. Since I set my foot in France and knew the traitor lived in Paris, I have watched carefully. I live retired in the house of my noble protector, but I do it from choice. I love retirement in silence because I can live with my thoughts and recollections of past days. But the Count of Monte Cristo surrounds me with every paternal care, and I am ignorant of nothing which passes in the world. I learn all in the silence of my apartments. For instance, I see all the newspapers, every periodical, as well as every new piece of music, and by thus watching the course of the life of others, I learned what had transpired this morning in the House of Peers, and what was to take place this evening. Then I wrote. Then, remarked the president, the Count of Monte Cristo knows nothing of your present proceedings? He is quite unaware of them, and I have but one fear, which is that he should disapprove of what I have done. But it is a glorious day for me, continued the young girl, raising her ardent gaze to heaven, that on which I find at last an opportunity of avenging my father. The Count had not uttered one word the whole of this time. His colleagues looked at him, and doubtless pitied his prospects, blighted under the perfumed breath of a woman. His misery was depicted in sinister lines on his countenance. Monsieur de Morcerf, said the president, do you recognize this lady as the daughter of Ali Tepelini, Pasha of Yanina? No, said Morcerf, attempting to rise. It is a base plot, contrived by my enemies. Ide, whose eyes had been fixed on the door as if expecting someone, turned hastily, and seeing the Count standing, shrieked. "You do not know me?" said she. "Well, I fortunately recognize you. You are Fernand Mondego, the French officer who led the troops of my noble father. It was you who surrendered the castle of Yanina. It was you who, sent by him to Constantinople to treat with the emperor for the life or death of your benefactor, brought back a false mandate granting full pardon. It is you who, with that mandate, obtained the Pasha's ring, which gave you authority over Selim, the firekeeper. It was you who stabbed Selim. It is you who sold us, my mother and me, to the merchant El Kobir. Assassin! Assassin! You have still on your brow your master's blood. Look, gentlemen, all!" These words had been pronounced with such enthusiasm and evident truth that every eye was fixed on the Count's forehead, and he himself passed his hand across it as if he felt Ali's blood still lingering there. "You positively recognize Monsieur de Morcerf as the officer, Fernand Mondego?" "Indeed I do," cried Ide. "Oh, my mother, it was you who said, 'You were free. You had a beloved father. You were destined to be almost a queen. Look well at that man. It is he who raised your father's head on the point of a spear. It is he who sold us. It is he who forsook us. Look well at his right hand, on which he has a large wound. If you forgot his features, you would know him by that hand, into which fell, one by one, the gold pieces of the merchant El Kobir. I know him. Ah, let him say now if he does not recognize me." Each word fell like a dagger on Morcerf and deprived him of a portion of his energy. As she uttered the last word, he hid his mutilated hand hastily in his bosom and fell back on his seat, overwhelmed by wretchedness and despair. This scene completely changed the opinion of the assembly respecting the accused Count. "Count of Morcerf," said the president, "do not allow yourself to be cast down. Answer. The justice of the court is supreme and impartial as that of God. It will not suffer you to be trampled on by your enemies without giving you an opportunity of defending yourself. Shall further inquiries be made? Shall 2 members of the House be sent to Yanina? Speak." Morcerf did not reply. Then all the members looked at each other with terror. They knew the Count's energetic and violent temper. It must be indeed a dreadful blow which would deprive him of courage to defend himself. They expected that his stupefied silence would be followed by a fiery outburst. "Well," asked the president, "what is your decision?" "I have no reply to make," said the Count in a low tone. "Has the daughter of Ali Tepelini spoken the truth?" said the president. "Is she then the terrible witness to whose charge you dare not plead not guilty? Have you really committed the crimes of which you are accused?" The Count looked around him with an expression which might have softened tigers, but which could not disarm his judges. Then he raised his eyes towards the ceiling, but withdrew them immediately, as if he feared the roof would open and reveal to his distressed view that second tribunal called heaven, and that other judge named God. Then with a hasty movement he tore open his coat, which seemed to stifle him, and flew from the room like a madman. His footstep was heard one moment in the corridor, then the rattling of his carriage wheels as he was driven rapidly away. "Gentlemen," said the president when silence was restored, "is the Count of Morcerf convicted of felony, treason, and conduct unbecoming a member of this house?" "Yes," replied all the members of the Committee of Inquiry with a unanimous voice. Ide had remained until the close of the meeting. She heard the Count's sentence pronounced without betraying an expression of joy or pity. Then, drawing her veil over her face, she bowed majestically to the councillors and left with that dignified step which Virgil attributes to his goddesses. And that concludes chapter 86. So now the world knows that the Count de Morcerf had behaved dishonorably when he was working when he was serving in the military and under the and coordinating with the Ali Pasha, and that he had indeed betrayed them. So we'll see what happens next. Tomorrow we have 3 more chapters. They are a little shorter than today's reading, but as always, excellent. And so yeah, we'll see what comes next based on these revelations, which Albert has now learned, that the disgrace of his father, the dishonor of his father, is now publicly known. And so we'll see how Albert responds tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day, and that you are having delightful things to drink. Bye.